Hey, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. So, this week we are getting into a discussion about sex work today. And we're first thinking about how do we define sex work in order to articulate what sex work is and also what it's not. So, thinking about, sex work would be defined as any type of labor that is intended to elicit an erotic or sexual response in a client. So this can range from, prostitution, which people tend to be, the key form of labor that is associated with sex work, but it's also, related to erotic dancing, BDSM professionals, cam work, different forms of like OnlyFans content and things like that. So, as we're thinking about how we define sex work in this conversation, we're thinking about how, conceptions of sex work have evolved, over the last, several decades, over the last, even few years. So we're thinking about how, in the course of feminist history, there has been this fraught relationship to sex work. So both mainstream culture and feminist history has had this, complicated relationship with sex work in the sense that, feminists have for years tended to conflate sex trafficking and sex work. So, similar to mainstream culture, we see this in, a lot of different forms of popular media, which, the panel discussion with Janet Mock that you all are looking at this week will delve into a little bit further. So we see in pop culture representations, we've seen through different, feminist scholarship, this tendency to identify sex trafficking as the same thing as sex work when they are very different. So why are they different? Sex trafficking would refer to, any form of, explicit coercion of someone into the sex trade. And this is intertwined with, a larger understanding of human trafficking, which is not limited to sex work, but can, refer to various forms of labor where there is, expressed coercion into that form of labor, into that trade. So, when we think about sex work, we're thinking about how, there are a variety of circumstances, a variety of, decision making factors that go into why someone would engage in sex work. And that element of expressed coercion is not present. So we're thinking about how when we're, identifying, what sex work, looks like, what sex work is, we're thinking about it varies in such a tremendous way why folks would engage in sex work. And with that, it's important to hear from sex workers themselves, why they engage in sex work, what the experience of engaging in sex work looks like for them, because, it demonstrates to us the ways that, initiatives to end sex trafficking by lumping sex workers into those causes, they tend to remove agency from sex workers. They tend to silence and, disenfranchise sex workers because they're essentially, identifying sex workers as a group of people that need to be saved. So this is very complicated, and we see the conflation between sex trafficking and sex work in a huge way, especially in the last few years, which the FOSTA Act, which was the Fighting Online Sex Trafficking Act, they basically, in passing this particular piece of legislation, were identifying all forms of sex work as, something that needed to be criminalized, specifically sex work that takes shape in digital spaces. So, folks may be familiar with a site called Backpage that, was terminated with FOSTA. And, with FOSTA gaining support, we saw how various celebrities such as, Lena Dunham, such as Meryl Streep, they came to support FOSTA, and they saw that the end to, sex traffic, a piece of legislation that was fighting the end of sex trafficking was, holistically a good thing. When sex workers came forward and basically were saying, by eliminating Backpage through the FOSTA Act, you're essentially making sex work more dangerous for sex workers, because Backpage was used as a way to vet clients, for sex workers to communicate with one another about different forms of predatory behavior. So it was basically a way for not only sex workers to, advertise their services and, put that information out there, but also for sex workers to, communicate with one another and keep each other safe. So there's a lot to be said with how, Lena Dunham and, Meryl Streep and folks like that came in saying, but this is something that needs to end, when they're not necessarily thinking about why is it important to hear from sex workers themselves about why Backpage is important, instead of lumping, this form of work, so lumping sex work under sex trafficking, and in turn, that conflation between sex trafficking and sex work, we see as, being harmful to sex workers. So it's important to note that, when we're thinking about how, sex work takes shape today, there's, so many different dynamics of choice and circumstance that do come into play. So some people choose sex work because they have limited options, and it's one of the key ways that they can, generate income. There's folks that choose sex work because they find great pleasure in it. There's people that choose sex work because they have a variety of other options, but they find this option to be the best for them. So, it's important to see how there's, so many, different gradients to why people would engage with sex work, and to take those into account. And this week we're thinking about, how perceptions of sex work have evolved and how you see them taking shape today, because we see more and more mainstream conversations about sex work, such as, Cardi B sharing her experiences with dancing, OnlyFans, especially during the pandemic, becoming much more visible and being used as a way to generate income. So I'm curious what you all think about this stuff, and we will talk on the discussion board.